So HMC says, question, do you think the Palestinians should ever give up their goal of reconquering all of Israel? Don't cop out by saying it's not my place to say. I'm asking your opinion. Um, so I think they already have. So so in 1988, the with the Declaration of Independence, the Palestinian Declaration of Independence, that declaration was the way of the Palestinian state to say that they accept a two-state solution, meaning that they would give consent to the secession of Israel from Palestine. So the way I understand this conflict is Israel is a secessionist entity that separated itself from Palestine, from the state of Palestine, and the peace process is the mechanism through which the state of Palestine needs to consent to the creation of Israel out of its own territory. So the 1988 Declaration of Independence basically said, we agree that we will accept that secession and we will stay in the West Bank and Gaza, provided that we get a right of return, we get to keep Jerusalem, East Jerusalem as our capital, and some other, further conditions. But I think at least the internationally recognized representative of Palestinian people has already given up that right. And I would counter argue in saying that again, this is all about nationalism, right? This is Palestinian nationalism fighting Jewish nationalism. And I think nationalism is a bad, I don't want to say it's a bad thing, but like it can often lead to bad results. So I would argue that framing this in the language of reconquering is problematic because like Israelis are there. Israeli citizens exist. They live there. They have their own identity. And my objective, as I was saying with the one-state solution that I propose, is for these identities to not be exclusive of other identities. Like you don't need to be exclusively Israeli to be Israeli. You can be Israeli and also have Palestinians living next to you. You can be Palestinian and have Israelis living next to you in a single state where everyone's collective rights are recognized. So I don't think that the language of reconquering Palestine is even necessary if you conceive of this conflict post-nationally. And as a post-colonial scholar, I tend to be post-nationalist. Not fully post-nationalist. I mean, I don't want to say that like national identities are useless or you should not have them. You can be proud of your country. It's just that they tend to be they tend to lead to bad results. They tend to lead to extremism and discrimination and otherization. So we need to be very careful around them. Major Carl says it sort of feels like you are indirectly asking him if he thinks Israel should not exist at all. I mean I can answer that. I don't think Israel should cease to exist. There's this argument that people make. Does Israel have a right to exist? And it is an interesting question because my position on this is it's poorly phrased. It's a poorly phrased question. I don't think states have a right to exist. I don't think that when Czechoslovakia split into Czech Republic and Slovakia, that they killed Czechoslovakia and that Czechoslovakia had a right to exist. I don't think that the Soviet Union had a right to exist. Hell, I don't think that. I guess taking it a little bit. Czechia mentioned. I don't think that. States even have a right to maintain their status quo forever. States can confederate, states can, do many different things, and that doesn't affect a supposed right to exist. Right? So I don't think states have a right to exist. I think states exist or don't exist, are created or merge with others and stop existing. That's a pretty normal thing that states do. Peru at what point was the Confederation of Peru and Bolivia, and people fought a war to prevent it, and eventually two countries separated again. But I don't think the argument would have been that Peru has a right to exist. So I think that's a poorly phrased question in the sense that Israel does exist right now. Israel does exist, and as such, it's silly to pretend like it doesn't. So I think that the big question, the actual question here is, do Israelis have a right to self-determination? And the answer to that is absolutely, unquestionably, yes. Israelis have a right to self-determination, understood as the ability to live your life in whatever way you want, right? And at this point, Israelis have the external self-determination, meaning that they have their own state, right? Not only are they able to live their lives however way they want, as say, for example, let's say, let me find an example. Walloons have self-determination, even though the Republic of Wallonia doesn't exist. It's only Belgium, right? So Walloons have internal self-determination within Belgium. Um, they only have external self-determination as Belgians. The Walloon identity doesn't have external self-determination, it only has internal self-determination. So Israelis right now have internal self-determination because they can do whatever they want in Israel, and they have external self-determination in that, Israelis through Israel can do whatever they want in the external world. That's not the case with Palestinians. Palestinians don't have internal self-determination because they live under apartheid. And Palestinians don't have external self-determination because they don't have a state that is recognized by some of the most important world powers in the world. They have a state, but it's a state that isn't recognized by the US, by the UK, by key states. So their external self-determination is very limited. Right? I think the proper question is, do Israelis have self-determination? And the question is, the answer is yes. Should they have it? Yes. Should it come at the expense of Palestinian self-determination? No, it shouldn't. So my point would be that I don't really care what the political mechanics are within Israel-Palestine. Both, all the people who live in mandatory Palestine territory, in historic Palestine territory, should have self-determination. Internal and or external, depending on the arrangement. So you could have a one-state solution where all Israelis and Palestinians live under the same Israeli-Palestine banner, and they have both internal and external self-determination within Israel, or within Israel-Palestine, within this new state that we're creating. Or you can have a scenario where there's Israelis in Israel and Palestinians in Palestine, and then whichever populations go back into the territory of the other, so like Palestinians return into Israel, and if there are any settlements that stay within Palestine, then Israelis living in Palestine, and they should be able to have internal self-determination in Israel and in Palestine. And externally speaking, in terms of external self-determination, the state of Palestine should, account for the self-determination of these people as well. So no one should be left out. I guess that's my point. So when you ask me, does Israel have a right to exist? My answer is, I think it's a poorly phrased question, and I would rather speak in terms of self-determination, and my answer to that would be more in lines of, I don't care what the specific state looks like, people should have self-determination. Like, no one should live in a state that doesn't care about them. Think about, for example, African Americans during Jim Crow. That is wrong. Palestinians currently as well. Apartheid is wrong. And no one should be denied this self-determination. So that is my point. I don't care what you call it. If you call it Israel and Palestine, if you call it Israel-Palestine, if you call it a one-state solution, a two-state solution, that's irrelevant. The point is that these identities, Israeli, Palestinian, they need to be able to exist with self-determination in whatever borders you want to be in. To the point where if an Israeli travels to the United States, they also should not see their rights restricted. They should also enjoy their self-determination as a resident in the United States. Right? Similar with the Palestinian that goes to, London. They should also maintain their rights to live their lives in freedom. Right? So it really doesn't matter where they are. It really doesn't matter what state they are in. It really doesn't matter what the political solution is and what's its name. It matters what are the effective rights that each person has within the borders of a state. And just like an Israeli has full rights when they visit London, a Palestinian should as well. And then Israelis and Palestinians should also have full rights, both in Israel and in Palestine, or in Israel/Palestine. So that would be my very long answer to that very interesting question. The Coogie says Arabs and Jews can and have always coexisted peacefully. Yeah, exactly. This is a multicultural part of the world, and part of the thing is that the creation of this like exclusive concept of nationality, of no, we need a national home for Jewish people only, is what set off the nationalist race in the Middle East. So to a degree, the expulsion of Jewish citizens of Arab states is a result of an Arab nationalism that formed out of the Natty Bags. Thanks for following. So this expulsion formed as a result of like the emergence of an Arab nationalism that formed itself in opposition to this exclusively Jewish nationalism in Zionism. So it was a perfect storm, right? These nationalisms started affecting people because they were always framed within the perspective of we need a state that excludes other people from its borders, from within its borders. So this is the state of the nation state of Jewish people. Therefore, this is for Jewish people, right, and not for Arabs. Arabs need to be expelled out. We need to get rid of the Arabs. So that created that exclusive Jewish nationalism, Zionism, created a backlash in the Arab world that was also forming its own nationalisms, like its own like Jordanian nationalism and like Tunisian nationalism. They were new things, right? They are the emergence of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and these nationalisms formed themselves in opposition to exclusive Jewish nationalism. So they also became exclusionary and broke relations that existed in this region for hundreds, if not thousands of years of peaceful coexistence. This is what I'm saying when I say that nationalism is problematic. It can lead to problems. HMC says right of return means demographic warfare to conquer Israel. I love how like we completely forgot about the the plan for today, and we're just having a Q&A. I really enjoy these Q&A, so I really enjoy that you guys are very active today. I should really remove the title. So HMC says right of return means demographic warfare to conquer Israel. After the Ramallah lynching, there is zero chance that any large-scale right of return will ever happen if there ever was such a chance. So again, I think the framing of conquest is at issue here. And I just noticed that you guys just returned from an ad break, and I see that HMC is not subscribed. So I'm gonna say this again. HMC asks about the right of return. So this way of framing the right of return as demographic warfare to conquer Israel, I find great issue in, because this is only so. This reasoning only makes sense if you are approaching Israel as an exclusively Jewish state that cannot have room within its borders to non-Jewish citizens that have self-determination. And as I said in the beginning, my framing is not about whether states have a right to exist or not. My framing is, do people have a right to self-determination wherever they are? And if what you're telling me is the only way in which I can accept Palestinians in my state is if they are second-class citizens, that's a problem. Oh, extras 5412. Thanks for following. So I think the language of the right of return as conquest is a problem, because if you are looking at the conflict from the perspective of this is my Jewish state and therefore I cannot allow non-Jews to immigrate, you are creating a state without self-determination. You are creating an apartheid state. So what I would argue is that the right of return should not actually affect anything in Israel, because it really doesn't matter who is the majority, provided that you recognize the right to self-determination of the people who live in Israel. Right? So this idea that whoever is in the minority will suffer. Hey, Fauci Koresh, thanks for following. This idea that whoever is in the minority will suffer is based on an idea of democracy that is really flawed. Democracy is not the dictatorship of the majority. Democracy is not we have more votes, so therefore you don't have any human rights. Democracy is not we won, so you shut up. Right? Democracy, in a democracy, let me how can I put this? So to address HMC, in a democracy there can be no such thing as demographic warfare, because in a true democracy you don't just say who has more votes, and whoever has more votes gets to oppress whoever has less votes. If that's your idea of democracy, you did not create a democracy, you created an apartheid state. You created an autocracy. You created an unjust system. In a democracy, you should be able to defend everyone's right to self-determination, everyone's human rights. It doesn't matter how many votes they have. That's just not something that that should inspire democratic thinking. Democracy is not the dictatorship of the majority. Democracy is a system where people vote and the rights of the people who live in that place are respected. If your democracy violates rights, then it's not a democracy. This is why the United States under segregation was not a democracy. I don't care how many people vote. So long as people don't have a right to self-determination and human rights, then that's not a democracy. Democracy is not the dictatorship of the majority. And so under a true democracy, there can be no demographic warfare. It doesn't matter how many people immigrate to Peru. It doesn't matter how many Venezuelans immigrate to Peru. So long as Venezuelans can live their life in whatever way they want, and Peruvians can live their life in whatever way they want, self-determination will still exist, the Peruvian way of living will be protected, the Venezuelan way of living will be protected, and the kids of those Venezuelans will likely not be fully Venezuelan and will not likely be fully Peruvian, they will be something else. And then the concept of Peruvianness will eventually change as well. These are lines that we draw in the sand, these are lines that we make up, these are lines that we invent, these are identities that emerge and submerge from history all the time. So long as you're protecting self-determination, there can be no demographic warfare. Because the right of Jewish people to live Jewishly, like to live their Jewish lives in Israel, will continue to exist, will continue to be protected, because you're protecting self-determination. So the right of return is only a demographic warfare on Israel if you believe that whoever has the majority has to have more rights. If you believe that whoever has the majority needs to have more rights, then you believe in apartheid. So I don't see the right of return as any kind of warfare, any kind of danger, if you create a system that protects self-determination and collective rights. HMC says, if you weren't born there, you can't return. That's a contradiction in terms. If you want to enter a sovereign nation whose citizens don't want you coming in, that's called being an invader. Israel has the right to defend themselves against invaders. Well, no, right? Because, let's take this step by step, okay? Bear with me, HMC. Okay, so first of all, there are people called absentees in Israel that have been displaced from their homes and live within Israel itself, and are the same people that were displaced that are still living within Israel, and they still don't get a right to go back to their home because their home was taken from them through expropriation and given to a Jewish resident. These absentees, they march through Israel every year to say we are still here. And this is not like the grandson of someone. This is the actual person that was expelled. Because remember, people have been expelled from their homes within Israel, not just in 1948, but also all the way through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s and 2020s. People are expelled from their homes within Israel all the time. So these people don't even match your definition. These are Israeli citizens that are considered absentees through various reasons, through various machinations, and then they don't have a right to their own property. Their property is taken from them. So just off the bat, then that isn't the case. That what you just described isn't the universal case. Now let's go to what you're saying. You're talking about people that lived in a specific place, had a house, and then a terrorist group, like a group that engages in terrorism, like what I was describing with Hamas. So short form answer, a terrorist group. Lehi or Irgun or the Haganah literally massacred people in their town so that they would flee. Like if you read the the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, really good book by Elan Pape. You will read how like at some in some parts of Palestine, people were pushed towards the sea with mortars so that they would flee to the ocean and drown. And the survivors had to leave that and leave those homes. So it is people that were born there. They just had kids while they were they were outside of the country because like they weren't allowed back in. But that property that they were expelled from should have passed to their kids, right? By sheer logic of any kind of like democratic state, if you have a house and you are still the owner, that house should pass to your kids. The reason why it didn't pass to their kids is because, again, they were considered absentees, because they were ethnically cleansed from Israel, and so their property was expropriated and given to a Jewish citizen of Israel. So this idea, if you weren't born, you cannot come back, it's not true at all, because if tomorrow you leave your house, I'm assuming HMC that you are in Israel, if you tomorrow leave your house in Israel and you go to live in London, and then a lot of time passes by, you have a long, fruitful life, you have kids in London, and you pass away, your kids own your house, and they have a right to return to that house, right? I mean, it feels pretty simple. It's the same with Palestinians. The only difference is that HMC, you're a white atheist from Texas. Okay, so imagine you're in Texas, you have a home, you move to London, and then you want to return to Texas. Like your kids want to return to Texas. I mean, sure, there should be some level of like, immigration law involved, but if they are your kids, most likely they will be American. And so they will be able to immigrate back into the US and live in that house, right? I mean, I'm not saying anything controversial. Now imagine a government says that because you left your home in, 2024, and you went to London, because you left your home, that house is no longer yours. It will pass on now to another Texan citizen. And because you left and you were, considered no, if I have kids with a British woman in England, my kids are not American citizens just because I was. I think so. I mean, isn't that the case? Doesn't the US have jus sanguis as well? Anyway, okay, then if they are not, US citizens, then you might have a problem because they might be stateless. So you might have another different problem. But let's assume, for sake of argument, that you are a responsible parent and you register them with the U.S. consulate in London. They should be able to go back to their home. And if a government says, look, you are part of those people who left the U.S. in 2024, so that means that one, you are no longer American, and two, you no longer have a right to property in that house that you had, so I'm going to expropriate it from you. And then some guy says, that is correct. You know why? Because if you weren't born in the US, you don't have a right to return to that property. That would be crazy, right? So why are you using that same argument to deny Palestinians the right to return to those homes? You are siding with the state that expropriated their property. It's weird. You are calling people that were born in Palestine, were expelled from Palestine, invaders in Palestine. Israel, Palestine, or whatever you want to, however you want to call that land. You can, they cannot be invaders if they were born in those houses and they have the keys to those houses. Rosava says refugees have a right to return to their homes. Yep, absolutely. I'm just trying to make this argument not about an argument to authority and say read the Refugee Convention. I'm trying to make an argument that is based more on the underlying logic of why that is correct. So HMC says any such claim was irrelevant. I want to say, like, I appreciate HMC's presence here today. He is making so far. I haven't gone to the bottom of the chat. For so far, he's made respectful arguments that are challenging, or my and I think the majority of the chat's views. So it's interesting. So I want to value that he's here saying this politely. Okay. So HMC says any such claims, of like that the Israelis were like that Jewish people were expelled from Palestine 2,000 years ago, as Big Brain said. Any such claims are irrelevant. The Zionists came to Israel Palestine's territory as legal immigrants under the legitimate government of the time and purchased land for money. Not all the land, and purchasing land does not turn that land into sovereign land. So this is a common misconception. So if I go to Texas, I go to, I don't know, let's say I go to Houston, and I start buying off every plot of land in the city of Houston, that doesn't mean that Houston is now Peruvian, right? That's pretty basic stuff. That doesn't mean that I can stand in the middle of Houston and say, from this moment on, this land is called New Peru. Buying land gives you no sovereign right. So I'm not sure I understand this idea that the land was purchased. Sure, it was purchased. That doesn't say anything. That doesn't give any sovereign rights. As to the fact that they were legal immigrants under the legitimate government at the time, I mean, yeah, I think the first Aliyah were pretty much immigrants. But as their plans became clear, they did not just come to Palestine and started buying off land and then declared independence. They created military wings, the Haganah, Irgun, Lehigh, and these military groups started, pushing back against the local population, who obviously in that scenario did feel invaded. And from a relatively peaceful relationship between the first Aliyah and Ottoman citizens in Palestine, the second and third Aliyah started facing a lot more resistance, and that led to like massacres against Jewish people, and it also led Jewish massacres against Arabs and British in that area. So HMC says they created Irgun and Haganah after the local population began launching unprovoked attacks. So this is where it gets tricky, okay? Because the first Aliyah didn't face this, right? There was no Irgun and no Haganah before 1929 Hebron massacre. Yes, but again, the first Aliyah didn't face any of this. It was only when we started getting into Iron Wall territory, where the population, the Arab population of Palestine, both in Ottoman times and in mandatory times, started seeing this Balfour Declaration type engagement that the Zionists had for the land, where they were clearly and openly saying, we want to colonize this land, like with those words, we want to colonize this, we want to turn this into a Jewish land. Like, if you read the British documents of the time, you will see that the British were very concerned about turning Palestine fully Jewish. They were very worried about that because they felt this is going to lead people to revolt. And of course, when you say to someone, and this is something that Jabotinsky says very clearly, when you say to someone, we will conquer you, they will rebel. Because again, nationalism, we're talking about these nationalists, the formation of nationalisms in that part of the world, it led to people to push back. And yes, they pushed back violently, and they pushed back with massacres, and that is wrong. And these are things that you should not, say, you should not look down on and ignore and say, it's not a problem. No, definitely there were massacres that should not be, minimized. But again, there is a context in which you are framing this as if the reason why Jewish people in mandatory Palestine faced these problems was because Arabs hate Jews. And I don't think that measures up with the history of the region, where there was not just the first Aliyah, but the old Yishuf living peacefully in that part of the world. The problem was when Zionism comes and says, we want to conquer you. And then that becomes a problem. And then that brings up violence. And violence begets violence. And eventually, yes, the massacre that you describe in Hebron leads to the creation of the Haganah and the Irgun, who also started, pushing back on Arabs, not just buying land, but expelling Arabs from the land. So again, I don't think that you can say that the Zionists came to Israel Palestine, to quote your comment. The Zionists came to Israel Palestine as legal immigrants. The first Aliyah did. The second and third Aliyah, however, didn't. They came with Jabotinsky. They came very clearly to settle the land and conquer it, to turn it from an Arab province of the Ottoman Empire into a Jewish state that would exclude Arab people from government, which effectively they have. There's a reason why the ICJ calls this racial segregation. So I don't think there's an interesting book by Mahmoud Mandani that argues is that the second and third Aliyah were not actual immigrants. Let me see if I can find it. So this is a neither settler nor native by Mahmoud Mandani. It's a really good book. You should check it out. So HMC says citizenship is determined by the sovereign democratic state. Israelis don't want to grant Palestinians not born in Israel citizenship. It's their prerogative not to. Yeah, but you see how these people had Palestinian citizenship at the same time as Israelis had Palestinian citizenship pre-1948. And post-1948, they just decided that Palestinian citizenship no longer mattered because they were going to replace the Jewish citizens' Palestinian citizenship with an Israeli citizenship, and the Arab citizens were going to get their Palestinian citizenship erased. I'm not sure how you can defend that. Like, yes, states can determine who is a citizen, but what happened here was the denationalization of people. They already had a citizenship. That citizenship was erased. So let me see. No Arabs. HMC says no Arabs got expelled or dispossessed before they launched a war of extermination in 1947. This is actually not true. So it is very common among Zionists to argue that Arabs from mandatory Palestine were left voluntarily because the armies of the Arab nations invaded and told them to flee. And they were invited to flee, and they did, because the idea was, leave the area where we will come, we will kill all the Jews, and then you can come back and we can create a completely Muslim Palestine. This isn't factual, because the actual war happened in, I think the exact date is May 15th, 1948. So that's when the Arab states actually invaded mandatory Palestine. Plan Dalit, the plan to ethnically cleanse and expel Arab citizens of mandatory Palestine en masse by the Irgun, the Haganah, and Lehi, was started in early 1947. I think early 1947. I'm not exactly sure of the date, but I think it was earlier, mid-1947, months before the invasion. So yes, Arabs did get expelled and dispossessed before the war. So factually wrong. The war was a reaction to the ethnic cleansing, not like it did not exist in a vacuum. So I think this statement, no Arabs got expelled or dispossessed, is factually wrong. Arabs did get expelled or dispossessed. We have Israeli archives saying so, even with the censorship. There's Israeli archival material that shows that Arab citizens were actually expelled by Irgun, the Haganah, and Lehi. So Big Brain is talking about how the British barred immigration to mandatory Palestine, and HMC says, and why exactly did the British bar them? Because they were trying to avoid civil war in Palestine. I mean, the main problem here is that the British were restricting immigration of Jewish people in a lot of ways through anti-Semitism. So they did not want Jewish people from Eastern Europe to immigrate into the UK. So they prevented Jewish immigration into the UK and allowed it into Palestine. But that was sort of like a ticking time bomb, because the people who lived in Palestine got mad at Zionists being allowed to immigrate with a plan to do what they eventually did, which was turn Arabs in Palestine into a second-class citizenry. So they wanted to avoid that kind of civil war, but they also were not willing to grant visas to Jewish Russians to come live in the UK because they were anti-Semitic. So they promoted as much as they promoted Zionism as much as they could, so that they would not need to include bring Jewish immigrants into the UK. It's the old alliance between Zionism and anti-Semites. There are a lot of anti-Semites who are Zionists because Zionism allows them to say, "You sent those Jews to Palestine, not to where I am." So HMC says Palestinians should accept a demilitarized state, and then they can admit whoever they want. But first, Palestinians must cease belligerency against Israel before the occupation can end. Palestinians have ceased belligerency against Israel. That's the Palestinian state. So the Palestinian state in 1988 abandoned armed force as a means of liberation. That already happened. The ones who didn't were Hamas, which is a separate group that exists only in Gaza and is, entering the West Bank little by little. But the representatives of Palestine, the state, have renounced armed struggle. They still did not get anything in return. There is no Fatah armed group attacking Israel in the West Bank. It just doesn't exist. The group that is continuing armed struggle is Hamas, and what average Palestinians are saying is Fatah, by abandoning armed struggle, accomplished nothing. So maybe we shouldn't abandon armed struggle. So in boycotting the existence of a Palestinian state, Israel has actually encouraged other groups to further their armed struggle instead of taking the opportunity of actually negotiating with the Palestinian Authority. The HMC says the PA did in fact attack Israel during the Second Intifada and murdered hundreds of civilians. So the Second Intifada, so 2000 to 2005. So you're talking about something that happened almost 20 years ago. So even if what you want to say here is true, that it was the PA and not, Palestinians living in the West Bank, it is still something that hasn't happened for the past 20 years. There are people who can vote that, were born after that. Palestinians keep starting aggressive wars against Israel, so yeah, they are the ones who need to be demilitarized. Palestinians have not actually started aggressive wars against Israel. Okay, so let's do this. The War of 1948, again, did not start with the invasion of Arab states. It started with the ethnic cleansing campaign launched by the Haganah. The War of the Six-Day War actually did not start, it started as a preemptive strike by Israel. Yom Kippur, yeah, granted. Okay, Yom Kippur, started by Arab states. And then, what other war am I missing? I don't know. Like there's been terrorist attacks, sure. Then there's been terrorist attacks, but there's not been wars launched, particularly by Palestine. Like Palestine right now could say that they are under attack by Israel and claim a right of self-defense and ask for support in fighting Israel. It hasn't done that. HMC says, can you show me one example of a nation with an Arab Muslim majority in which no Islamic laws whatsoever are imposed on non-Muslims? Lebanon? So I'm not sure I get your point. Like, do you like that? Do you think that's? I mean, do you think that the majorities of specific countries should impose on minoritarian groups specific conditions? Like, do you think it is okay for non-Jewish countries to impose on Jews, non-Jewish rules? Are you defending that? Because otherwise, I don't see the argument here. Um, if what you are saying is, I'm not sure what you are saying. Like, other than making an argument against, Muslim states and Islamic states, I don't see what you are saying. Are you defending that, or are you criticizing that? Because if you're criticizing that, then you shouldn't want that for Israel. And if you're defending that, then we disagree. you know. So I'm confused as to the argument. Are you defending the religious imposition of minorities or not? If you are defending it, we disagree. I think it's wrong. If you you will not see me defending Saudi Arabia here. If you are against it, then why are you advocating it? So I'm confused as to the argument. HMC says, which Zionist militias and terrorist groups were committing crimes before the Hebron massacre of 1929? Is it relevant? Like, is who started relevant? I'm not sure. Again, I'm not sure I get the argument. So, I mean, is it relevant who committed the first massacre? Because I'm not sure it makes any difference. Okay, let's assume that you're correct, and that until 1929 there were no Jews committing atrocities against Muslims in Palestine. So, what does that change? Does that justify Zionist atrocities against Muslims? Does that justify apartheid in modern day Israel? Does that justify Plan Dalit? Does that justify the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Palestine? Of course not. Who cares? Again, what we should be worrying about is self-determination. That the people who live in Israel Palestine should have self-determination, like the first Aliyah had when it immigrated into Palestine without intention of creating, a settler colony. So I'm confused as to the value of the argument. HMC says, as I understand it, the Arabs were angry. Why were they angry, HMC? What could have possibly happened? And began rioting and carrying out attacks on the Zionists because the Zionists were refusing to assimilate into Arab culture. HMC says, I don't believe that it's because Arabs hate Jews. I believe it's because Zionists brought a European culture which the Arabs saw as foreign and the Zionists refused to culturally assimilate. Oh, so you're getting into oof, this is what is this? Like the Arab Great Replacement theory. I mean, again, this idea of assimilation is not really very reasonable when you consider that Jews coexisted with Muslims in Palestine for centuries before this. The problem was not bringing a European culture. The problem was trying to impose that European culture. That that the first Aliyah coexisted with Arabs, and when the second Aliyah arrived, they were angry that Jews were working in Arab lands and or hiring Arab workers in their land. And they got mad at that because they saw in Palestine a mechanism for, this sort of civilizational upgrade of Jewish people. So it should be Jewish people who employ Jewish people in farms, and not Jewish working for Muslims, or Muslims working for Jews. Because what they wanted was to create an exclusively Jewish settlement called the kibbutz. So there's a difference in the first and second Aliyah. And so when you say Zionists brought a European culture which Arabs saw as foreign, they had already brought it with them. Importantly, Russian European culture, but they had already brought it with them in the first Aliyah, and nothing happened. It started to become a problem when what they brought was not, quote, European culture. What they brought was colonialism. You're confusing European culture with colonialism. Majid Kral says Jews aren't necessarily European. That is true. There's a lot of Mizrahim who are Arabs who are of Jewish faith, and their identity as Arabs has been destroyed because of the nationalisms that emerged in 1948. So HMC says, I'm surprised to see an anti-Zionist saying this. Ashkenazi Jewish Zionist immigrants were absolutely bringing a European culture with them. Yes, but you see, Ashkenazis were not the only ones to immigrate into Israel. Like, there's a lot of Jewish people in Israel that are Mizrahim, not Ashkenazi. So you're missing information here. Arab and Muslim citizens, says HMC, are not subjugated second-class citizens. Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank are not citizens. They're occupied stateless people. So you see the problem with what you're saying, right? First of all, a large part of East Jerusalem is occupied and has been annexed. So Israeli law does apply there. Also, Israeli law applies to the settlements where Palestinians are not allowed in. And then as an occupier, you have a right to defend the human rights of the people you occupy, and you don't. You subject them to racial segregation. So that argument, the second part of the argument, is very moot. It really doesn't make any sense. You cannot just say you're a conquered people, therefore you don't have any rights. This is not 1350. This is like 2024. And the idea that Arab citizens of Israel are not subjugated, they are so subjugated that you cannot even call them Palestinian citizens of Israel. You are saying Arab citizens of Israel because you want to deny them their Palestinian identity. Palestinian citizens of Israel do not have the same property rights as Jewish citizens of Israel. They don't have the same nationality laws as Jewish citizens of Israel, and they cannot just marry someone from the West Bank and bring them into Israel because they don't have the same civil rights as Palestinian citizens of Israel. So what you're saying is completely false. You have fallen prey to propaganda. Palestinian citizens of Israel are considered absentees, and so they don't have the same property rights. And also Bedouin citizens of Israel are being evicted from their lands as we speak. Lands that they have occupied since before Israel even existed. So that is not true. Palestinian citizens of Israel do live as second-class citizens in Israel because of the absentee property law, because of the restrictions on nationality and marriage that they face, and because you shouldn't really divide Palestinians in those that are occupied and those who are not. So you see, HMC, I want to be clear on this. Like, I value what you brought to this chat, because it made this conversation the kind of conversation that, say, for example, Twitter doesn't allow, in that you are making your arguments and we are just arguing back. I will say, though, that some of your views toy with anti-human rights. You are dividing populations. You're granting and denying rights to populations based on whether they are Palestinian or not, whether they are Jewish or Israeli or Palestinian and Muslim. You are flirting with like civilizational arguments that want to put, quote unquote, Western civilization above the rights of other quote unquote civilizations. And that is dangerous discourse because you end up in this kind of like clash of civilization-y argument where you're not saying that there are superior and inferior races, but you are saying that there are inferior and superior cultures, and those cultures tend to be of specific races. So I really want to, like, in good faith tell you, you are flirting with some dangerous ideas here. Because when you talk about great replacement, when you talk about whether Jews brought European civilization with them, you are flirting with this idea that there's a hierarchy of civilizations, and then there are the barbarian civilizations, the semi-civilized civilizations, and the civilized civilizations, and that is plain racist 19th century discourse. So you need to be careful about that. Majid Carl says, depends on who those human rights are for. He defends some but not others. Yes, exactly. That's the point. So human rights is not about, I mean, it is to a degree about what rights you're defending and what rights you are not defending. That is true. But it is just as important that you also apply those rights to all humans. Because it is very common that some humans are dehumanized. Palestinians are dehumanized. And I feel like what HMC is doing here is he is flirting with this like anti-human rights discourse of dehumanization, of your rights depend on whether you are Palestinian or you are Jewish, because there is such a thing as Western culture, and that culture is superior. And you're flirting with that. You haven't actually said it, but you're flirting with that, and it's dangerous. And I would advise that you like tread carefully, because you brought you brought intensity to this discussion. That is good. I enjoy an intense discussion. I like what you did here today. I didn't like the flirting with civilizational theory and the idea that there are some superior cultures, and that the Jews brought Western civilization to the Arab world, and the Arabs wanted the Jews to assimilate to an inferior culture, and that's great replacement. I didn't like that. Other than that, I think this was an interesting conversation. I appreciate your time here, and thanks for following. So keep bringing it up, by all means. But be careful with where your ideas take you. Okay.